Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The truck was still there, the door was locked, and his laptop, his lifeline for class, was on the kitchen table. Clint never left things that way, never. It was January 28th, 2025. Just after 11 a.m., Kelly Edwards pulled into the driveway of a modest single-story home on a quiet street in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She hadn't heard from Clint Bonnell in over 24 hours, an anomaly in their routine. He messaged her every morning, even if it was just a thumbs up. But that day nothing came. No texts, no check-ins, no response to her calls. When his professors reported him absent for a second day, it triggered a wave of concern she couldn't ignore. Inside the house, there were no signs of forced entry. The alarm system hadn't been tripped. The living room was clean. Clint's wallet was on the counter, along with his keys and a mostly charged phone. The laptop, open but idle, sat where he usually left it when heading to class. His military-style backpack leaned against the doorframe, untouched. There were no shattered plates, no broken furniture, no blood. But something was off, Kelly told police later. He was meticulous. He never just walked out mid-task. It felt like he'd just vanished mid-thought. The front door had been locked from the inside. The responding officer from the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office completed a preliminary welfare check. Nothing was reported stolen or out of place. But due to Clint's military background and current enrollment in a graduate-level program at Methodist University, the case didn't sit like a normal disappearance. Within hours, it was passed to the Criminal Investigations Division. Clinton Bonnell was 50 years old, a decorated retired Green Beret with over 2 decades of service. He had completed multiple overseas deployments and returned to North Carolina only recently. After retiring in December 2024, he enrolled in the university's physician assistant program, planning to transition into medical service. His peers described him as dependable, driven, and even obsessively punctual. He had no history of medical or psychological issues, no criminal record, no enemies as far as anyone could tell. But Clint had complications at home. He was separated from his wife, Shana. They had lived apart for over a year, he in Fayetteville, she in Virginia, where she worked as a traveling nurse. Clint had told several friends that he planned to finalize a divorce by March. There were financial disputes between them, and tensions had grown over the prior months. Still, no one expected this. By January 29th, Clint's instructors had filed an academic absence report, noting that he had missed multiple classes without notice. Friends grew increasingly concerned. When police performed a second walkthrough of the residence, investigators noted that Clint's ID badge for school was still hanging by the door. His textbooks were stacked for the next day's assignments. A half-drunk protein shake sat in the fridge. All routine, all abandoned. A crime scene technician from the Sheriff's Office Evidence Unit was called in to conduct a more detailed analysis of the interior. Under a standard ultraviolet sweep, minor smudging was located on the kitchen floor near the refrigerator, but there were no immediate indicators of foul play, no pooling, no drag marks, and no visible evidence of a struggle. Still, the details didn't sit right. Detective Brian Kalin, the lead on the case, described it this way. Veterans like Clint don't just vanish. If something's wrong, they leave a trail, a move, a message, a reason. We had none of that. By the end of the week, authorities expanded their investigation. Phone records were subpoenaed. Clint's mobile showed no outgoing calls or texts after the evening of January 27th. The last signal from his device pinged off a Fayetteville cell tower at 10:12 p.m. After that, radio silence. Surveillance footage from neighboring homes didn't reveal any outbound vehicle movement from Clint's driveway. No car engine was recorded, no headlights caught by external cams. Police noted one curious detail, however. The Ring camera facing Clint's front door had been manually deactivated, not erased, just turned off at the source. When questioned, Shana told officers she hadn't seen her husband in several days. She said they were infrequent in contact and that she hadn't traveled to North Carolina recently. Her statements were brief and unadorned. No visible alarm, no emotional distress. She offered no leads. Meanwhile, Kelly reported something different. She told detectives that Clint had a scheduled meeting with a divorce attorney on the very day he disappeared, and he had messaged her that afternoon to say, quote, It's done. I'll send you the final doc soon. That message, sent at 3:43 p.m. on January 27th, was the last verified contact Clint ever made. A forensic analyst flagged Clint's laptop for further examination. On inspection, it was found to have a sharp circular indentation piercing through the top left casing. Upon closer analysis, the puncture hole penetrated deep into the internal motherboard. That alone wasn't typical wear. It resembled low-velocity ballistic damage. Investigators weren't ready to label the case a homicide. Not yet. But they knew this wasn't a routine missing persons file anymore. Not with an unexplained impact hole, a disabled front camera, and no trace of movement from a man who'd survived more than a dozen deployments in combat zones but failed to show up for a Tuesday lecture. Clint's neighbors described hearing nothing unusual. No raised voices, no loud bangs, no late-night vehicle noise. If something had happened, it hadn't been obvious. But the data trail was too clean, and sometimes that was the problem. By February 1st, 2025, the investigation into the disappearance of Clint Bonnell shifted from a welfare check to a working felony case. The turning point wasn't an eyewitness account, a dramatic tip, or a sudden confession. It was a single hole in a laptop casing, half an inch wide, centered over the motherboard, with edges burned and warped from impact. Detectives assigned to the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office Major Crimes Unit brought in a certified forensic ballistic specialist to examine the damage. What initially looked like a dent from impact damage was quickly ruled a penetration point consistent with a small caliber projectile. Inside the device, the copper-jacketed base of a .22 caliber round was recovered, fragmented between the heat sink and a warped fan blade. Clint's laptop, previously assumed to be just another piece of left-behind property, was now classified as primary forensic evidence. That upgrade triggered the full evidence protocol, glove handling, chain of custody documentation, and a formal analysis request filed to the State Crime Lab in Raleigh. At the same time, investigators re-entered the residence for a secondary forensic sweep. The point wasn't to find blood, it was to trace impact trajectory. Using digital crime scene mapping software and laser angle projection, analysts recreated the positioning of the laptop when the bullet struck. The angle suggested the device had been sitting upright on the kitchen table when hit, facing outward, towards someone standing in the center of the room. That alone introduced a disturbing possibility. The shot was fired indoors, likely at close range, and the laptop had unintentionally absorbed it. The scene remained clean. No spatter, no visible exit wounds, no spent shell casing. But next came the second discovery. Inside Clint's tactical-style backpack, investigators found two objects: a partially crushed stainless steel water bottle and a spiral-bound lecture notebook. Both had clear puncture damage, clean, cylindrical, and consistent with bullet travel. The water bottle bore internal ricochet markings. The pages of the notebook were torn in a sharp diagonal, with fibers that aligned to heat damage. Ballistics confirmed same caliber, same velocity, same origin point. But if shots were fired, why wasn't there more mess? Why weren't neighbors alerted? Why had no one heard gunfire? Forensic acoustic analysis of the home's structure offered one explanation. Thick drywall, combined with soft furniture, carpeting, and a single-level layout, made the interior acoustically absorbent. And if a suppressor had been used, even a .22 would barely register beyond the property line. What wasn't known, yet, was whether Clint had been struck by that round. There was still no body, still no confirmation of foul play, but in criminal investigations, evidence doesn't require a corpse. A weapon discharge, particularly one embedded in the victim's belongings, creates a legal shift in posture. Detectives filed paperwork that same day to elevate the case status from missing person to suspicious disappearance under criminal circumstances. Digital forensics picked up where ballistics left off. Investigators obtained a search warrant for Clint's iCloud account and university email. His last message sent through campus servers was time-stamped 3:48 p.m. on January 27th, an upload submission for a pharmacology paper. After that, silence. No logins, no keystroke activity, no cloud syncs. Phone records also confirmed the last outgoing call pinged from a Fayetteville tower at 10:12 p.m. that night. His phone was never used again. Data confirmed Clint didn't leave Fayetteville alive, but how he disappeared remained unresolved. A separate line of inquiry targeted the home's surveillance infrastructure. Investigators removed the internal memory unit from the ring system mounted above the front door. Unlike typical cloud-connected models, Clint's camera system stored locally on a micro SD drive. The last recorded frame was 6:13 p.m. on January 27th, showing Clint walking toward his front door, keys in hand. After that, nothing. The camera wasn't erased. It was disabled at the switch, manually. This fact mattered. If Clint had left the house voluntarily after 6:13 p.m., the camera should have recorded his departure. It didn't. No one else had remote access to the system, which meant someone physically turned it off after he entered. Investigators now had four primary forensic pillars. A bullet embedded in Clint's laptop, ricochet damage in his backpack contents, a disabled surveillance system, zero outgoing digital or physical movement after 10:12 p.m. on January 27th. Detective Kalin later stated, "It's rare to see all the pieces line up this early. Physical, digital, ballistic, chronological. It usually takes months. This time it didn't, which made us uncomfortable. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem." Fayetteville doesn't often handle high-profile disappearances involving former Special Forces personnel. The nature of the evidence, precise, deliberate, minimal, felt tactical, and that escalated internal concerns. One procedural update followed another. An official BOLO was issued. Interstate alerts were sent. Clint's estranged wife, Shana, was re-interviewed via phone by investigators in Virginia, where she lived and worked. According to notes in the report, she appeared non-defensive but disengaged. She claimed she hadn't seen Clint since Christmas. No further details offered, but inconsistencies started stacking. Travel logs showed her vehicle, a dark-colored SUV registered in Virginia, had been tagged by a Fayetteville traffic camera 2 days after Clint disappeared. She hadn't disclosed that trip. Detectives requested state-level assistance to begin tracking movements through license plate readers, toll logs, and highway surveillance. The digital dragnet expanded. If Clint had been harmed, transported, or buried, something, somewhere, had to show it. For now, there was no body, but there was a shot, and that changed everything. February 25th, 2025. 40 miles south of Fayetteville, a man casting his fishing line off the muddy banks of Gray's Creek spotted something floating just below the surface. It was wrapped in what looked like industrial-grade trash bags, partly sunk, caught in an eddy between two reeds. At first glance, it resembled discarded debris, maybe construction waste or roadside junk. But when he pulled it toward shore with a branch, the weight didn't feel natural, and it didn't smell like trash. He called 911 at 9:42 a.m. His voice was steady, just descriptive. "Something's wrong with this bag. It's got weight to it. I think it might be human." When deputies arrived, they didn't open the plastic on site. The bag was triple wrapped, bound tightly with painter's tape, and partially filled with water to weigh it down. Officers carefully lifted it out and transported it directly to the Cumberland County Medical Examiner's office. There, in a controlled environment, forensic technicians began the process of recovery. Inside were human remains, torso only. No arms, no legs, no head, no clothing, no identification. The body was decomposed consistent with submersion in cold water for approximately 4 weeks. The decomposition pattern showed aquatic exposure, but little animal predation, suggesting the bag had been submerged and sealed throughout most of the period. The absence of extremities was not due to scavengers. It was due to deliberate dismemberment. Forensic pathologists determined the victim was male. Musculature and bone density placed the likely age range between 45 and 55. The skin, though discolored, still bore evidence of healed scars on the left shoulder, consistent with previous surgical intervention. X-ray imaging revealed multiple metal fragments embedded along the right thoracic cavity. Ballistic examination recovered a deformed .22 caliber projectile lodged between the fourth and fifth ribs. Trajectory analysis suggested a frontal shot at close range. The bullet path angled downward, consistent with a seated or lower position at the time of firing. Another fragment was located in the lower spine, Though the torso lacked fingerprints and facial identifiers, DNA samples were taken and fast-tracked to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation lab. Forensic anthropologists also noted remnants of distinctive tattoos on the upper chest, partially preserved. Cross-reference with existing military medical records and known identifiers from the Clint Bonnell case led to a preliminary match within hours. 4 days later, on March 1, 2025, the lab returned confirmation. The remains belonged to Clint Bonnell. That news formally ended the missing person case. Investigators convened a task group to reprioritize forensic sequencing. With the body located and confirmed, the case entered a new phase. Analysts could now match the entry wound's ballistic angle with damage to Clint's laptop and personal items, tying physical injuries directly to objects found in his residence. There was no evidence that Clint died anywhere other than inside his own home. The precision of the cuts, clean, deliberate, symmetrical, indicated use of medical-grade tools or someone with experience in anatomical dissection. It wasn't improvised, it was methodical. That detail altered the suspect pool. Criminal analysts also highlighted the disposal method. The bag was layered, sealed, weighed with wet sand, and left in a location not immediately visible from main access roads. The placement required local knowledge. Someone knew that spot wasn't patrolled, wasn't trafficked, and wasn't likely to be disturbed until spring. Cumberland County Sheriff's Office released a formal statement acknowledging recovery of remains and confirming identity. The statement avoided mentioning condition or cause of death, but the public now knew what detectives had feared from the beginning. Clint wasn't missing. He was murdered. The press ran with the headline, "Green Beret's dismembered body found in North Carolina Creek." The story spread quickly. But behind the media flare, law enforcement remained focused on sequencing evidence, not speculation. Investigators revisited Clint's cell tower data to overlay with known vehicle traffic near the Grays Creek area between January 27 and January 30th. Using plate reader logs and highway surveillance footage, they began triangulating which vehicles entered the zone around the estimated disposal window. One SUV appeared twice, a dark blue 2017 Hyundai Santa Fe with Virginia plates. It was registered to Shana. That vehicle, and its exact movements, became the primary focus of Chapter 4. By early March 2025, the investigation into Clint Bonnell's murder entered a new operational phase. The discovery of his dismembered torso in Grays Creek had confirmed what law enforcement already suspected. But confirmation alone wasn't closure. The question shifted from what happened to who moved the body and how. With the physical remains now cataloged, forensic priority pivoted toward vehicle tracking and geolocation data. Investigators focused their attention on a specific time frame, January 28th to January 30th, the critical 48-hour window following Clint's disappearance and preceding the presumed date of body disposal. North Carolina Highway Patrol provided access to Regional Automated License Plate Reader, or ALPR, systems, strategically placed along key state routes and intersections near Fayetteville. One particular hit stood out. A dark blue 2017 Hyundai Santa Fe bearing Virginia registration was captured at two different checkpoints on January 29th, both near the access corridor to Grays Creek. The license plate matched a vehicle registered to Shana, Clint's estranged wife. What made this detail significant wasn't just her connection to Clint, it was her previous statement to investigators. During her first phone interview with detectives in late January, Shana had stated clearly that she hadn't been to Fayetteville in weeks. Now, digital systems said otherwise. The first license plate capture occurred at 3:02 a.m., roughly 10 miles from the neighborhood where Clint lived. The second was logged at 3:44 a.m., heading southbound, less than 5 miles from the wooded inlet where his remains would later be found. Investigators requested a search warrant for Shana Cloud's vehicle and her mobile phone data. That request was approved by a district judge on March 4th, citing inconsistencies in testimony and emerging forensic evidence. Once obtained, her mobile GPS logs added another critical layer. Cell tower triangulation and native GPS data from her Samsung phone confirmed that her vehicle was stationary for approximately 17 minutes on a remote access road bordering Grays Creek at 4:12 a.m. on January 29th. The signal then resumed along a northbound path back toward I-95. The duration, location, and directionality of her travel raised immediate red flags. This was not a detour. This was an intentional route, with no prior history of activity in that area on her device. The forensics team noted the lack of pings to fast food, gas stations, or cell towers in the area, a straight point-to-point drop-off pattern. For analysts familiar with disposal cases, this wasn't speculative, it was procedural. Digital investigators then cross-checked historical GPS data on Shana's device for recurring location hits. From October 2024 through January 2025, her phone had never once pinged near Grays Creek. The January 29th route was her only recorded presence in the area. Separately, forensic vehicle technicians conducted a forensic vacuum and swab analysis on her SUV after executing the warrant. Results returned trace elements of organic tissue and human blood particles embedded in the cargo mat fibers. Initial luminol tests had been negative, likely due to cleaning or dilution, but DNA later confirmed the presence of Clint Bonnell's genetic profile. By March 10th, investigators had assembled a sequential profile of movements. January 27, 6:13 p.m. Clint last seen on home surveillance. January 28th, no activity on Clint's or Shana's digital devices in the Fayetteville region. January 29th, 3:02 to 12 a.m. Shana's vehicle captured near disposal site, stationary for 17 minutes. February 25th, body discovered in location matching GPS data. March 4th at 10, vehicle and phone analysis confirms contradiction in her initial statement. This was no longer a circumstantial situation. Investigators were now dealing with direct contradictions backed by time-stamped forensic evidence. Internally, detectives flagged an important point: the level of planning, device disabling, route choice, time of night, lack of digital noise, did not align with a spontaneous act. These behaviors were calculated, possibly rehearsed. In towns like Fayetteville, murder investigations don't unfold on instinct alone. They move on data. And when that data tells a story more clearly than any witness ever could, the weight of the truth becomes hard to dispute. But even with mounting evidence, the team knew that evidence in motion doesn't always translate to legal proof of motive or intent. Forensic accuracy is one thing. Conviction requires narrative clarity, especially in court. That's why, before making any arrest, they needed one more layer: a behavioral and psychological profile, not just of where Shana Cloud had been, but why she might have gone there at all. That part of the case would come next. By mid-March 2025, the physical and digital trail had narrowed the timeline. GPS logs, vehicle data, and forensic confirmation placed Shana Cloud within striking distance of Grays Creek during the critical disposal window. But location data, no matter how compelling, doesn't explain motive. That part of the story required context: psychological, financial, and relational. And it began with what Clint Bonnell had quietly been preparing before he disappeared. Clint had not been impulsive about the divorce. In fact, he had laid the groundwork carefully over several months. According to statements from his attorney, Clint had formally initiated the filing process in December 2024, shortly after retiring from the Army. The reason, the attorney said, wasn't scandal. It was exhaustion. Clint no longer wanted to maintain the appearance of a functional marriage when, in reality, he and Shana had lived apart for over a year. He had confided in close friends about the strain. There was no physical abuse, no explosive fights, just a quiet, persistent breakdown. Clint had moved forward with school, routine, and rebuilding. Shana, however, remained tied to the life they once shared, financially, legally, and in name. And according to investigators, that dynamic would soon become the focal point. Financial records revealed that Clint had recently shifted the majority of his VA and military retirement benefits into a separate account under his name alone. He had also notified his university to change his emergency contact from Shana to Kelly Edwards, his girlfriend. Though small on the surface, those moves marked a decisive break. Detectives obtained a search warrant for Shana's banking history. Over the course of 2024, her spending patterns showed a reliance on Clint's military income to supplement inconsistent paychecks from short-term nursing contracts. There were periods, weeks at a time, where her personal income dropped to near zero, followed by sudden spikes in outgoing transfers and large withdrawals. More telling was a series of declined debit transactions from January 30th, 2025, just one day after Clint's body was believed to have been disposed. The account had been frozen due to Clint's name being removed from the joint account. Investigators cross-referenced these financial shifts with a timeline of Clint's final days. On January 27th, just hours before he disappeared, he had texted Kelly, "Got the docs finalized. I'll file them Friday." The Friday he was referring to was February 2. He never made it that far. Behavioral analysts brought into the case focused on a term often seen in domestic homicide cases: loss of control through separation. Not rage, not jealousy, but the erosion of legal and financial identity after a breakup, particularly in situations where one partner depended on the other's benefits or public-facing stability. In Shana's case, the dependencies were layered. Her vehicle was still co-leased under Clint's name. Her listed address on medical licensing paperwork was Clint's Fayetteville property, and her last IRS filing listed joint income. To those reviewing the totality of these documents, it wasn't difficult to see the fracture point forming. When Clint officially cut legal and financial ties, it would have left Shana's existing framework, professionally and personally, exposed, not destroyed, but different, changed. And that change wasn't one she had prepared for. Within days of receiving this analysis, the prosecutorial team convened with investigators. The evidence was mounting in structure, not just weight, not one detail alone, but collectively. The financial separation, the vehicle movement, the forensic trace, and now the motive framework. Cases like these often carry a human cost beyond the victim. The complexity of modern relationships, especially when legal entanglements linger after emotional ones end, create pressure points. For some, that results in conflict. For others, irreversible action. What remained was whether prosecutors believed the assembled profile and evidence supported an arrest warrant. And by March 20th, they had their answer. By March 22nd, 2025, the case against Shana was no longer theoretical. The forensic timeline was locked. The behavioral profile supported intent. The DNA, GPS data, and financial separation all aligned under a prosecutorial framework that allowed for a felony arrest warrant on 2 counts: first-degree murder and concealment of a death. The arrest didn't come with a knock. At 6:47 a.m. on March 28th, U.S. Marshals, working alongside local authorities in Virginia, located Shana outside a rented townhouse in Chesterfield County. She was walking alone, dressed in medical scrubs, and carrying a coffee thermos when they approached. The arrest was executed without resistance. She asked no questions. She didn't request clarification. She simply stated she wanted an attorney. The vehicle seized on site, her blue Hyundai Santa Fe, was towed to a forensic processing unit in North Carolina for a 3rd round of analysis. The SUV had already produced trace DNA. But what investigators were now looking for was residual trace evidence: microfibers, soil samples, and potential impressions from items transported in its rear compartment. They found partial contact transfer on the spare tire liner, minute traces of pond sediment consistent with soil samples taken from the bank of Gray's Creek. Shana's personal devices were taken into custody. Analysts reviewed her deleted messages, cloud storage, and health tracking data. One small detail stood out. On January 28th, the morning after Clint Bonnell was last seen, her smartwatch had logged an elevated heart rate between 3:50 and 4:30 a.m., with steps recorded despite no other location-based activity being open on her phone. Investigators flagged this inconsistency: biometric evidence not often introduced in court, but increasingly valuable when tied to spatial movement already confirmed. During interrogation, Shana declined to speak. Her attorney advised against comment, and no statement was provided. In court, prosecutors filed a detailed affidavit outlining the probable cause. It included her direct contradiction of travel to Fayetteville, GPS data showing her vehicle near Gray's Creek during the disposal window, Clint's DNA in her cargo area, financial motive, including banking changes and dependency on Clint's income, the anatomical precision of the dismemberment, and her history as a licensed nurse with medical training. She was held without bond. The response from the community was restrained but pointed. Clint's former classmates at Methodist University organized a small gathering in his memory, holding photos from deployment, academic transcripts, and his final assignments. Many noted that his transition from military to civilian life had seemed seamless, a testament to his discipline. Behind that, though, few had realized the private strain he carried. There's often a misconception that violence comes with visible warnings, loud fights, threats, public breakdowns. But the Clint Bonnell case challenged that. There had been no police reports, no known domestic incidents, no restraining orders. What it revealed instead was how silent fractures in a marriage, financial control, emotional disconnect, long-distance separation, can compound into an irreversible rupture when left unaddressed. This wasn't about a sudden outburst. It was about the slow erosion of one identity tethered to another, and the decision, calculated or desperate, to erase the source of that loss. As of early July 2025, Shana Cloud remains in custody awaiting trial. A grand jury has confirmed indictment on both charges. Her defense team has not issued a formal plea or public statement. Jury selection is tentatively set for fall. The evidence chain is intact. The timeline is closed. But what remains unresolved are the psychological details behind the act. Details that may never be spoken aloud, even in court. And that's not uncommon. Some murders don't come with a confession. They come with data. By early April 2025, the investigation into Clint Bonnell's murder had entered a new arena, no longer driven by discovery, but by preparation. Prosecutors in Cumberland County were tasked with converting layers of forensic data, digital trail markers, and behavioral history into something courtroom-ready. The evidence chain was strong, but strong evidence alone doesn't guarantee a conviction. Jurors need a story, accurate, logical, irrefutable. The district attorney's office began with structure. Each element of the case had to serve a defined function: establishing opportunity, confirming means, demonstrating motive, and linking all three through provable actions. Anything speculative was cut. What remained was a streamlined evidentiary outline, dense but coherent. The timeline was central. Prosecutors mapped Clint's last known appearance, captured on home surveillance at 6:13 p.m., January 27, 2025. They followed it with complete digital silence. No phone activity, no class attendance, no financial movement. Then the ballistic trajectory embedded in his laptop. Then Shana Cloud's vehicle, captured on license plate readers at 3:02 a.m. on January 29th, near Grays Creek. Her smartwatch logged movement during that window. Her SUV later yielded DNA consistent with Clint, each step built upon the last. Rather than overload jurors with too many standalone facts, the DA's office worked with forensic analysts to organize testimony by discipline, not just chronology. Forensics would testify first, specifically the pathologist who oversaw the post-mortem analysis. The cause of death would be stated directly: multiple gunshot wounds, close range, likely inflicted indoors. The report was unambiguous. There was no mention of hesitation wounds, no struggle, no signs of defensive trauma. The implication was clear. Clint was likely ambushed, not attacked in a confrontation. Ballistics followed. The embedded .22 caliber fragment retrieved from Clint's ribcage matched the damage on his personal laptop and tactical gear, both of which were recovered intact from his home. It wasn't speculation. The angle of entry, force pattern, and fragmentation density all lined up. This placed the fatal shot and the shooter inside Clint's home, not outside of it. Digital forensics came next. Analysts would present Shana Cloud's GPS data, her phone's travel log, and even biometric readings from her smartwatch. One key fact prosecutors flagged: on January 29th, between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m., her device registered elevated heart rate and walking activity while no calls, texts, or navigation tools were active. In isolation, it meant little. In context, it placed her body and her vehicle at the scene of disposal. Jurors would also hear about banking records, how Clint moved financial control into a solo account in mid-January, and how Shana's debit card failed multiple transactions shortly after his disappearance. These weren't just financial details. They were pressure points. But prosecutors didn't plan to rely solely on data. They enlisted expert witnesses, a forensic psychologist to explain the psychological significance of separation-based motive, and a crime scene analyst to clarify how clean dismemberment pointed to anatomical familiarity. Shana's nursing credentials were entered into evidence, not to suggest premeditated cruelty, but to show the technical feasibility of the disposal. Still, there were no eyewitnesses, no confession, no recovered murder weapon. The strategy, therefore, focused on accumulation over admission, each piece reinforcing the previous one until alternatives became mathematically unreasonable. In pre-trial hearings, Shana Cloud's defense team attempted to suppress the GPS data and vehicle forensics, arguing the evidence was circumstantial and lacked direct observation of the act. But the judge denied the motion. The evidence wasn't speculative. It was scientifically extracted, time-stamped, and legally obtained under proper warrants. To strengthen the presentation, prosecutors prepared a visual sequence for the jury, a chronological model combining timestamps, location points, and forensic markers. When rendered as a continuous chain, it formed an unbroken loop between Clint's last known movement and Shana's. There's a reason these preparations matter. Trials don't just test guilt, they test coherence. And if prosecutors failed to deliver that in a way jurors could retain and connect, reasonable doubt could wedge its way into the verdict. As the court date approached, Clint's family remained publicly silent, but coordinated with victims' advocacy representatives to ensure their impact statement would be ready should conviction be reached. The task ahead wasn't about narrative, it was about translation, turning raw evidence into prosecutorial language without exaggeration, without inference. The truth, they believed, was sufficient. As of July 5, 2025, Shana Cloud remains behind bars in Buncombe County, North Carolina, awaiting trial for the alleged murder and dismemberment of her husband, Clint Bunnell. The formal charges include first-degree murder, concealing a death, and obstruction of justice. No plea has been entered. No confession has been made. And yet, the evidence speaks, clearly, methodically, and without mercy. Investigators never got a breakdown on motive in a traditional sense. No manifestos, no texted threats, no drunken bar confessions. What they had instead was the kind of hard data that rarely lies: geolocation records, search histories, trace forensics, and one of the most methodical disposal efforts detectives in Buncombe County had ever seen. The physical evidence remained the backbone of the case. The torso retrieved from Lake James, wrapped in contractor-grade plastic, weighed down with concrete bricks, and bound with nylon rope, was matched to Clint Bunnell using DNA extracted from prior medical records. Dental records confirmed the identity of the skull fragment, located in a separate cove nearly 800 feet from the first recovery site. The separation of body parts wasn't random. It was measured, calculated. The manner of dismemberment suggested the use of a reciprocating saw, likely battery-powered, and consistent with marks observed on the recovered bone fragments. Ballistics analysis of the .45 caliber bullet retrieved from Clint's thoracic cavity revealed lands and grooves matching a handgun found in a locked toolbox in the garage of the home he shared with Shana. A search warrant had yielded that weapon after investigators used LPR, license plate reader, data to place Shana's vehicle near the property on the night Clint was last seen alive, January 27, 2025. No security camera captured the murder. No neighbors reported gunshots. Clint's cell phone went offline at 10:18 p.m. that night, but not before it pinged in his own driveway, then inside the house, and finally, briefly, on the edge of Shana's family property, 15 miles east. From there, the device vanished. It has never been recovered. What raised additional concern was the financial activity. Days after Clint was reported missing, investigators discovered that multiple online banking sessions had occurred on his account, from an IP address registered to a secondary internet line within the Cloud residence. Several transfers totaling $1,250 were traced to Shana's name. Clint's military pension had been rerouted. In court, prosecutors are expected to argue that this wasn't an act of passion, nor was it accidental. They'll present it as a premeditated killing, followed by calculated dismemberment, intended to delay identification and obstruct investigation. The defense, meanwhile, has offered no public comment, no alternate suspect, no claim of self-defense, no motion for mental evaluation. Silence has been their strategy so far. The absence of a confession has complicated things only on the surface. Forensic technology, especially in high-profile homicide cases, now routinely circumvents the need for a direct admission. With enough cross-confirming digital and physical evidence, prosecutors can make a compelling case, even in the dark. From a procedural standpoint, the case has remained clean. There's no known misconduct. The chain of custody for all evidence has held. No crucial piece has been ruled inadmissible. Experts from both the state crime lab and independent forensic consultants have verified the findings, each layer reinforcing the previous. But beneath the procedural integrity lies the human toll. Clint served his country in the U.S. Army Special Forces, known informally as the Green Berets. He completed multiple overseas deployments, trained in tactical survival, and received commendations for service. He had lived through hostile territory abroad, only to die in his own home, allegedly at the hands of the woman he shared that home with. Family members have declined interviews, but court filings show that Clint had begun proceedings to finalize a divorce weeks before his death. Restraining orders were being considered, but had not yet been filed. In one email recovered from his laptop, Clint wrote to a friend, "It's going to get ugly before it gets better, but I'm done playing nice." That message, time-stamped January 23, 2025, would be one of the last electronic records in his name. It's easy to view these cases as a linear descent, anger leading to violence, leading to concealment, leading to prosecution. But real life rarely follows that arc cleanly. Clint's death wasn't a single moment of heat. It appears to have been the result of gradual corrosion, emotional, financial, psychological, accumulated over years and then weaponized in a single night. What remains is the silence of a body found in pieces, the silence of a spouse who has not spoken publicly, and the silence of a courtroom still waiting to hear the full narrative, under oath, under law. For now, Shana awaits her trial, scheduled tentatively for late fall 2025. She has been denied bond. Prosecutors are not pursuing the death penalty, citing the completeness of physical evidence, but acknowledging the lack of direct witness testimony. If convicted, she faces life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case will not conclude with dramatic testimonies or sudden confessions. Most likely, it will end with a deliberation behind closed doors and a sentence handed down by strangers bound by law, not emotion. But its lesson lingers, because it reminds us that violence doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it slips through in silence, in quiet planning, in digital traces, in things deleted but not forgotten. In the end, justice is never just about courtrooms or verdicts. It's about what we carry forward. If there's one thing I've learned from telling this story, it's this. The warning signs we ignore today can become headlines tomorrow. In moments of doubt, speak up. In moments of fear, reach out. Your silence will never protect you. And if this case has reminded you of someone you love or someone you lost, hold them closer tonight. If this video moved you, leave a comment with your thoughts or simply share where you're watching from. And if it didn't resonate, I'd still love to hear why. Your voice matters here. If you found this story meaningful, please hit that subscribe button and follow for more real-life stories that dig deeper than headlines.